Welcome to the Concrete Briefing. I am your host, Carter Concrete. Today, we are conducting a forensic investigation into the structural integrity of a cultural and economic monolith. We are analyzing the rise and the eventual catastrophic dissolution of Roc-A-Fella Records. This is not a story of bankruptcy or creative exhaustion. On the contrary, the label was a slam dunk success that never suffered fundamental financial losses. Instead, we are exploring a poignant tragedy of fractured brotherhood, where the internal fissures of loyalty eventually toppled a multi-million-dollar pillar of black economic power. To understand the collapse, we must first analyze the foundation. The cornerstone of Roc-A-Fella was laid by three visionaries, Jay-Z, Dame Dash, and Kareem Bigsburg. From a journalistic perspective, their partnership represented the ultimate unified front, a translation of neighborhood bonds into raw business leverage. However, we must argue that the very environment that birthed this success, one marked by a systemic lack of economic opportunity, also planted the seeds of its demise. In underserved urban landscapes, resources are historically scarce. This scarcity creates a psychological framework where loyalty becomes intensely localized. We call this the geographic loyalty trap. As the label grew, the internal politics didn't just become professional. They became territorial, eventually splitting the camp along the historic fault lines of Brooklyn versus Harlem. Let us dissect the primary argument. Unity is not a guaranteed byproduct of success. The decline was fundamentally precipitated by a total breakdown in communication between Jay-Z and Dame Dash. Jim Jones, a pivotal witness to these events, reflects that had these two leaders simply maintained a dialogue to resolve personal grievances, the collapse likely would have been averted. When the executive leadership of an institution fails to maintain its core relationship, it creates a power vacuum. This vacuum does not remain empty. It is filled by the anxieties and competing interests of the subordinates. We must examine the regime mentality. Individuals like Memphis Bleek, hailing from the Marcy projects, embodied unwavering loyalty to the regime. Bleek functioned as the loyal soldier, a term rooted in urban survival codes where protecting the leader is synonymous with protecting the tribe. Conversely, the arrival of Cameron and Jim Jones in 2001 introduced the Harlem loyalty. Jones's allegiance was strictly focused on stating his priority was making sure he was good, so we could be good. This shift transformed a singular corporate entity into two separate vibrations. The label was no longer Roc-A-Fella. It was a contested territory where street-forged bonds became the bedrock of high-stakes business decisions. The drama intensified through a series of tactical power moves that illustrate how a struggle for respect can undermine collective advancement. Consider the presidential conflict. Tensions reached a boiling point when Cameron was allegedly appointed president of Roc-A-Fella. This move deeply offended Beanie Sigel, a dedicated artist who felt his loyalty had been bypassed. In an environment where respect is the primary currency, a perceived slight is not just an insult, it is an institutional threat. When Jay-Z connected Sigel and Dash on a call that resulted in words, it signaled that the founders were no longer on the same page regarding the label's hierarchy. Observe Jay-Z's linguistic shift during this period. He began utilizing the phrase, "Hobbs home the global phone." This was a brilliant, albeit defensive, strategic pivot. By expanding his perspective to the wider industry and the global scale, Jay-Z was seeking stability outside of the domestic friction of the label. He was outgrowing the internal turmoil by transcending the local geography that was tearing the company apart. Perhaps the most thriller-esque and tragic element of this story is the undermining of individual success within the group. Jim Jones eventually secured a prestigious executive role as an A and art director for Warner Music Group, a monumental achievement for a black man from an underserved community. Yet, when Dame Dash and Cameron encountered him in this professional setting, Dash mockingly referred to him as a worker and a pumper. This was a calculated attempt to devalue Jones's professional advancement. Why? Because the fractured culture of the label had devolved into a crab-in-a-bucket dynamic. Jones argued that they sought to undermine him because he had attained an executive position they knew they could never reach themselves. This reveals a devastating truth about the struggle for economic power. Internal rivalry and jealousy can become more lethal than external systemic factors. In conclusion, the story of Roc-A-Fella Records is a masterclass in the fragility of institutional power. The facts are clear. The rock didn't break because of the market. It broke because of the men. The inability to maintain the foundational brotherhood created a vacuum that forced every artist to choose a side, Brooklyn or Harlem. Unity is our greatest currency. In a world defined by a lack of good education and systemic poverty, we cannot afford the luxury of internal friction. When success is achieved, the mission must shift from gaining power to maintaining the communication required to keep it. Because when the rock breaks, the economic future of the entire community shatters along with it. I am Carter Concrete. This has been the Concrete Briefing.